Hi, hello everybody, and welcome to the latest in our Stellar Speaker series of events. We're absolutely thrilled today to have Professor Kiran Trehan with us. Very honoured that we've been able to get some time in Kieran's incredibly busy diary. Kiran is our Pro-Vice-Chancellor for Partnerships and Engagement at the University of York, and she's also the Director of the Centre for Women's Enterprise Leadership, Economy and Diversity. So you will gather from her titles that she's an incredibly busy person, and we're very glad to have her with us today. Now, it said in the holding slide that we were going to have ask you to pose questions via the Q&A button, but actually, given the size of our group and the way that we'd like to shape this, we'd really love you to just join in the conversation and have those questions live. Do feel free, please, to unhide yourselves, and when the time comes, to unmute yourselves too, of course, and just join in as you wish. Kiran, if I can hand over to you.
That's great. Thank you so much. Well, first of all, good afternoon, colleagues. This is a real delight for me because I get a chance to kind of talk to a group of people who share some of my passion and some of my challenges in terms of, an area called leadership. Now, I know normally on Zoom calls like this, the expectation is you have a speaker, I speak at you, and I probably hold your attention, if I'm very, very lucky, for about 10 minutes, and then you wish you've got a million and one other things that you think you could be doing. So I want to change the format a little bit because this is an important topic, and it's an important topic for all of us for so many reasons. And so the theme of what I want to talk about and engage in a discussion and a dialogue with you is around responsible leadership, and can responsible leaders still make irresponsible decisions? And if so, how does that happen? What does the leadership of the future look like post-pandemic? So much of our focus is about developing the next generation of leaders, but also us taking up leadership positions. But what does that look like? What does that feel like? And what does that kind of mean? And so before I start a very short presentation, sharing with you, latest thinking, latest ideas, I'd really want to get a sense of the things that excite you about leadership and the things that perplex you. So what I'd like to do is for each of you, just in a couple of sentences, and there's not a right or wrong answer to this, but it's the things that you feel, in your heart that you're passionate about. So I want you to tell me in a sentence or two, just who you are, and what is the one thing about leadership that excites you, and what is the one thing about leadership that perplexes you or challenges you? And so to kick off, let me introduce myself, not through the formal bio and everything that you've had, but a little bit about who am I really behind this role and this senior leadership position that I hold. Well, I'm a kid who grew up in the back streets of the East End of London. And for many of you who don't know the East End of London, it has a very strong working class roots. I was one of those children who was told she'd never get to university, and so never even to dream about those things. And so at a very early age, I became very curious about, I guess at the time I didn't know it was leadership, but how do you lead? How and why is leadership so important, to the world of business? And the one thing that excites me about leadership is the new opportunities, to change the shape and vision of leadership. And the one thing that continues to cause me sleepless nights and perplexes me and challenges me is why, in 2021, we still have a lack of diversity and inclusivity in our senior leadership positions. And those are kind of things that I want to talk about in terms of how we make some of those fundamental changes around the levelling up agenda. So that's me. And now I'd like to go around the room. Now, this is a time when you don't need to be shy. And so you're all sitting there waiting, thinking, oh God, is she going to come to me first? And so rather than me do that, well, one of you kick the conversation off and unmute yourself and tell us who you are and the one thing that excites you about leadership and the one thing you'd like to take away by the time you leave this afternoon that perplexes you. So start wherever you want. And we haven't got a lot of time, so I want to kind of whiz through this so that we can really engage in a conversation. So don't be shy.
Okay, I'm going to be really brave. And I'm Kyla Holt. I know all of you, I think, already, but I'm head of alumni and volunteering at the university. And one thing that makes me feel hopeful, or that gives me great encouragement about leadership today, is that it does seem to be becoming more authentic and more honest, and that we no longer expect our leaders to be paragons of virtue, but we expect them to be human, and understand that, but that we do expect them to have an honesty, a degree of honesty about what it is that they're trying to achieve with their leadership. The thing that worries me about leadership these days is that we don't expect our leaders to be paragons of virtue. That really worries me as well. And that it's okay for leaders to be liars and cheats and manipulators and just downright awful, evil people, some of them. And that I'm thinking of political leaders in particular here, although I suppose we've all come across leaders in industry that might fall into that category as well. And that really worries me. How can we have trust in our leaders if they can't be trusted as people?
Great, thank you. Thank you, Ken. And I'm going to pick up on a couple of those issues about trust in my presentation. So colleagues, don't wait, unmute and speak.
Okay, I'm Frances. Hello. And I think one of the things that excites me just generally with leadership is the ability to shape strategy and to look at things, I would like to think, from a more logical point of view and look at over the piece, because sometimes we can be narrowed down into what we're focusing. So a leader is to look at the overview. And I think a challenge that any leader faces is sometimes you have to make tough decisions, but at the same time to keep people on side, and that inevitably raises a challenge.
Thank you. Those are great observations, Frances. And you're absolutely right about what I call the art of possibility. Good intentions and yet bad outcomes sometimes. And we'll kind of explore that a little bit. So thank you for being brave enough to go first.
Right, can I go? I am Peter Burley. I am chairman of the London Alumni Committee, and thank you very much for the invitation to join this. Just a couple of thoughts about leadership, and this is both when I've been in charge of teams and also in teams. What I found most satisfying is when leadership can be used to achieve something and by consensus, as opposed to leadership which is just about somebody being in charge and what they do just doesn't really matter. And of course, I think you may be able to work out somebody who fits that profile quite well. So it's achievement and consensus and team building. That's what I've really enjoyed about leadership over my career. Thank you, Peter.
And it's really interesting because you talk about those elements as part of your career. And what I'm really fascinated by, from the research that I've been doing, how important post-pandemic, how those particular kinds of skills and insights have come back to the forefront. And I'm going to pick up on, the why behind that, and also what the next generation is kind of demanding. Because we often think about, our own leadership stories and our own leadership journeys, not thinking about a new generation of leaders who are both talking and walking with their feet. So thank you for raising that. Where next?
Hello, I'm Andrea, current peer mentor and postgrad student. I think what excites me about leadership is that what it seems to do is enable already existing resources and talent to just flow in the most efficient way possible. And which is a bit general, but and what I find challenging or perplexing about it, correct me if I am wrong, but there seems to be research out there saying that the more someone is in a leadership position, actually the less they become attentive towards other people's sort of concerns and how they are perceived, and they kind of tend to lose touch. So it seems to suggest that you can't have the same person having huge amounts of power like continuously. And it needs to be, leadership needs to be renewed in some way.
That's really insightful, Andrea. You raised two really core important things for me that the research again, helps us make sense of. How do you learn to lead in the context of your values? how do you ensure that you don't become the kind of very leaders that we say that we don't want to be? I remember very early on in my career, when I became a head of department, I remember saying to my best friend at the time, if I ever end up like person A, would you just give me a real nudge? Because sometimes when you are part of a system, you become part of, you know, without even conscious, some of those things are unconscious processes. And that whole area about refreshing and renewing leadership, both in terms of style, but also making sure that our leadership, you know, and the way that we teach leadership, the way that we develop leaders is fit for purpose. The world is changing at such a rapid pace, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. How do we ensure that we're not just repackaging leadership in the hope somehow, if we just simply keep moving the jigsaw pieces, you know, we'll get it right. So thanks for kind of raising those.
Something that I definitely feel excited about, especially in the current COVID era, is the home working and that movement to businesses being able to offer more flexible working opportunities. I think in the past there's been quite a big drain of amazing talent. I'm thinking most especially around parents really who want to juggle childcare and work, but also people who have disabilities or for other care and responsibilities. So I think that that is really exciting and hopefully something that might be able to be taken forward in the future. And something that I find perplexing or challenging is very similar to what you just said actually, but about how do you retain your values whilst also trying to be a good leader in the organisation that you're in.
Thank you. Thanks again, Natasha. That's again, you've highlighted something which actually the pandemic has helped to see, is what I call leadership in unusual places. You know, we still know when we talk about diversity and inclusion, you know, and equality for all, but particularly in the area of disability and, you know, working parents, how those challenges still fall and are very still gender biased. And I'm going to raise some of those. But what we've also seen, though, is a new types of leadership and new working environments forming that might help us again think about how we deal with some of those challenges. And I'll pick some of those up in my presentation shortly. So thanks for that. I'm just swiftly moving along. Anybody else that would like to go next?
I work with Peter with the London Alumni Committee, and way back when I was the first ever female ENTS chair at York, so I kind of started early. You touched on it very early on, Kiran, about don't do as I say, do as I do, and the example that you sets the tone. If you as a leader do not follow, you know, your own strictures or your own guidance, you're going to be landed in a lot of trouble. The other thing is about listening and empathy. And for people not to be afraid to approach you. And if you're in an ivory tower and handing down diktats, I think that's you're just going to fail big time. So those are the kind of things that I'm looking for from a leader. And when I have to lead projects or whatever, then I'm trying to listen as well as talk, and not to trip myself up by getting it wrong, not doing what I think is right.
Thank you so much, Justin, because for me it kind of resonates at so many different levels. There is something about finding our voice, isn't it? You know, and people always say, well, does that come with age? Does that come with experience? And, you know, my argument is it comes with when your gut tells you, you know, we don't talk about the emotionality of leadership. You know, we make leadership sound as if it's, you know, a rational process. Many of my colleagues at York, you know, I know they find me very amusing because I often say, I had no desire to be a Pro-Vice-Chancellor. You know, I often say I couldn't think of anything worse. And it's, you know, I mean, I've got admiration for people that want those kind of positions. And it wasn't because I didn't aspire to lead, and lead authentically and to make a difference. But it's about, you know, those self-doubts. It's about having those voices. It's about stepping up. And, you know, we often talk about stepping up tomorrow at the next one. I'm just not quite ready. And that was my, you know, my inner voice. I'm just not quite ready for this step up. And again, a very critical friend and a critical challenger, because I think everybody should have critical friends. So those are not the ones that say, you know, when you say, oh, what do you think about this? And they're always very supportive. They're the ones that hold that very sharp mirror up to you. And they said in a sentence, you cannot do this work. And when you have a chance to step up and lead to make a difference, choose to step down. And that resonated and it stayed with me, because it's something about not leaving it to the other to make the change, just in the way that you talked about, Justin, very early on. You made, you know, whether it was an informed decision, whether it was an a decision based on your intuition, but you found a voice. And I want to talk about finding voice in leadership and finding emotions and putting the emotions and power back into leadership in terms of kind of responsible business. So thank you, because that, you know, really does, you know, kind of resonate. So just moving along then, I'm delighted. Anupam, I'm so pleased to see you, because our paths crossed in a prior event, and I wonder if you might want to say, you know, your two pieces around leadership. And it's lovely to see you again.
Yeah, sure. So what I think is with leadership, something that excites me the most is like when we can think of a vision and something that we can work towards as a team and achieve that goal and make a difference and make a change in people's lives. That's something that excites me a lot. And I would very agree with Jocelyn when she said, you know, what infuriates me the most is when leaders are not empathetic and not understand the perspective of the juniors and their employees. I think that they need to understand where they're coming from, which I see more often than not, like around me. That happens quite a bit. So yeah.
Great, thank you. Again, some really interesting points, particularly I'm going to touch on around new thinking about inclusivity around leadership rather than the diversity of leadership. Because for me, diversity points to what I call governance and processes, but inclusivity is about value and culture change, which then, you know, opens up new dimensions for thinking about leadership of the future. So thank you for that. Just a couple more then. Phil, did you want to say anything in relation to, you know, things that excite you about leadership and the one thing that kind of perplexes you?
Well, Kiran, lovely to see you, and sort of also to see you in York. And it's nice to see Joss there as well. We were both in the same students' union at York in the late 70s. So, and I think the last time, Kiran, we had direct contact, you were the examiner for one of my PhDs at Chester. So it's a small world, really. I think resilience is, yeah, learning from cultures, pulling back. I think also getting the best. I mean, one can see both the best and the worst, I think, at the moment. You know, I was talking to somebody before, we're writing a piece actually about public affairs around inoculations and injections and the various campaigns to have theirs first or whatever worldwide. And you can see the way it becomes political. But I mean, leadership at the moment to me means being able to pull a team together and grapple with the core issues. And also, it's very pleasing in many ways when one sees the multi-ethnicity and skill set really as some of the people we've got in the health service. I found it quite amazing the other week when the guy who was the head of injections, really, I suppose you crudely call it, really, of whatever committee it is, because we've all come used to all these committees, he's obviously Chinese ethnic, you know, and the guy who was the expert on sort of chests and things, he was obviously from the Indian subcontinent. And you can actually hardly see anybody who was probably of my style, really. I think there was the odd Jewish emigre in there, but it is actually showing that getting the best out of talents and skills and harmony is what it's all about. And I think that's going to be even more important, actually, in moving things forward as we, if you like, move out the COVID world. But no, I think that's what it's about, and that communication, and that's where I think the best entrepreneurs are going to be.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Phil. It's always lovely to see you, and it's been far too long. So Phil and I go back a long way, and we've been partners in crime for more years than I can kind of remember. And when I saw Phil Harris, I had to do a double take and thought, is that Phil? Yes, it is Phil, which is really lovely. Phil, you help shine a light, particularly around entrepreneurialism, and I think there is a huge amount we could learn from entrepreneurs and creating entrepreneurial mindsets for our future leaders. And I want to touch on that and explain why. And also you've helped shine another light, particularly around when we talk about diversity and inclusivity and where are these leaders. Sometimes it's also about visibility and in the way that we do things. And I want to touch upon how we create environments, you know, where actually people do want to strive for leadership positions, and they do want to kind of make that difference, but not just in the kind of traditional sectors that we are familiar with, but also what I call our backstreet leaders, because COVID-19 has shown us some of the most innovative leaders actually haven't come through their roles or their status. They've come through different parts of the institution, you know, and organisations by stepping up. And I want to touch about what we might learn from that. So finally, then I just want to, I've got two more. Jasmine and Dennis, did you either of you want to come in and say something?
Yeah, I want to talk about the, this is Dennis from China.
Yeah.
I also want to talk about the vision things as well. Nowadays in China, we have seen a lot of startup companies. And then from those startup companies, how can we organize people properly? How do they make a huge impact to the industry they are working on? I think it's more about, I understand the technology may do a lot of help, but how do we integrate those technology with human beings, with people? I think that's the vision, and that's the characteristic of the leader that matters. So I believe if a good leadership, if a good leader with a great vision and people are all believing it, then he or she will make things different. That's what leadership is talking about.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Global leadership is absolutely going to be vital, you know, and when we look at this notion of culture and what leading in cultural context means, not just in terms of organizational culture. Okay, I want to just make sure, is there anybody else that wants to come in before I just share with you a very short presentation, and then I want us to be able to have a critical dialogue about the future, you know, and some of the challenges that you would like to kind of work on. So is there anybody else that wants to come in, or am I okay to go with a short presentation? Okay, I'm going to go with the short presentation, and I'm going to share my screen with you and just stop my video for 2 seconds, otherwise you'll get lots of you know, back noise from it. So in hearing you talk about leadership, what I was really struck by is the changing nature about our world is changing. And so why is it that we do have responsible leaders and yet we still have irresponsible decision making, because we don't wake up saying, today I want to be an irresponsible leader. And so if you look at the kind of systematic challenges that the world is facing today, whether it's around climate change, sustainability, equality, diversity, the pandemic, leadership cannot now be confined to a small minority. It requires organisations to work together to cultivate leadership at all different levels. And that's the kind of proposition that I want to start with. And the second challenge I want to make a case for is that actually it isn't okay, and it's not okay, and no longer simply about companies being focused on measurements that are financial, like sales and profit margins and share prices. Of course, that's absolutely critical, because without those sales, without those profit margins, we can't survive. And we're seeing that as business after business begins to fold. But there's also a more increasing emphasis for me on inclusive and responsible leadership. But what does that actually mean? How do businesses ensure that their companies are both socially and environmentally sustainable as well as profitable? And why would that be important? Well, it's important because actually our stakeholders, our customers, leaders of the future are thinking carefully and seriously about the sort of business they want to work and operate in. And each of you talked about the things that inspire you, the kinds of companies or businesses or roles that you've had and where you've been able to make that difference. So I guess I'm making a case really that business and society demands different kinds of leaderships. And we've got to move away from the simple leader-follower model of so many years that have gone past. And with such a diversity of stakeholder obligations, to manage and include, and I don't just mean in terms of business, I also mean in terms of, enterprise and public services, the supply chains. So if you think about how we've been collaborating with, scientists and environmental protection, the dynamics are far more complex and nuanced. So in truth, company leaders may in the past have been, about immediate business needs, but leaders of the future are going to have to be much more than that, because the very nature of work is changing. And the other dimension of that is, which I'm really pleased about, the research that we've been conducting is showing that it's actually values-driven leaders, rather than those chasing external incentives and rewards, who actually perform much better and have organisations that are more sustainable. But we can't pretend performativity isn't part of being a leader. It's a central part. Performance is going to be still critical, but that doesn't mean it's a direct contradiction to being responsible. When I say to people, okay, so what makes a responsible leader? We use words like open, selfless, inspirational, strong, good values, a visionary, a cross between, an entrepreneur and an activist. So how did those sorts of values and skills and qualities rest within the context of business, organisation, public services, and the third sector? Because alongside that, we also have, leadership theories, which argue that leadership isn't simply that power lies within a single, an all-encompassing heroic leader. Leadership of the future, as we've seen, is not only situational, but it's also interrelational. But there's something about shared purpose and shared leadership, so how do we ensure that leaders of the future are both facilitators and they have the fluidity about unlocking the potential of employees? How do they innovate? How do they lead? How do we invest more time encouraging, staff with new ideas, but also allowing room for failure you know, building up some of these peer-to-peer models. And the pandemic over the last kind of, 12 months has shown us some of the most innovative ideas have actually not come from the top. They've been bottom up, you know, and people have stepped into those spaces to create new ways of working. So I guess I'm making a case for disrupting leadership as we know it, both in terms of its structures and processes, and thinking about disruption as a process of enhancement, so transformative leadership that actually allows collective decision making and provides a better perspective than we have currently. But then that doesn't happen overnight. You know, that requires leadership to think about workplace culture and the value of diversity and inclusion. And I said at the very start of my presentation, I talked very much about the kind of future human skills that we might need in relation to that. So, and diversity and inclusion are critical, but so is things like creativity and curiosity and communication in ways that we don't think about. I talked about entrepreneurialism, creating entrepreneurial mindsets. So I think that is absolutely really, really important. So if we think about some of the prominent trends in terms of leadership over the last decades, you know, we know that CEOs are taking a real lead on social issues because actually society is making a real plea and a demand for a change for the better. But staff are also wanting emotional investment in their work. You know, they don't want to just be robotically performing, you know, sales and profits, you know. So we need to think about, in terms of developing leaders of the future, how we harness and try and improve the kind of entrepreneurialism and curiosity and creativity and communications that might be really helpful in thinking about how we tackle the complex social problems of not just of today, but of tomorrow. When I'm asked to do talks on leadership and to talk about the future of leadership, I always say I'm talking to the wrong people, because actually the leaders of tomorrow are those young people in our community, in our schools, in our colleges, in our universities. And we've got to work with them to kind of co-design leadership that is much more inclusive. And why do I say that? Well, because one of the most obvious reasons is the continuing inequality and lack of diversity in the workforce, especially in leadership positions. So you might be surprised, astonishingly, that in 2018, there were as many men called Dave or David as there were women who were CEOs of FTSE 100 companies. Just 7 Black CEOs, and even fewer, numbering just 1% of the Fortune 500 companies. So in 2019, making up only 3.2% of the executive and senior management team. And I'm not making a case for diversity because it's simply the right thing to do. I'm making the case for inclusivity because it makes good business sense. And it makes good business sense because we know that diverse leadership teams are creative, they make better decisions, are more innovative, and actually they outperform their industry averages, you know, in terms of both financial, economic, and social factors. So there was a report done by McKinsey's, and they found that their gender diversity leadership teams were 25% more likely to experience above the average profitability and 36% more likely if their executives were ethnically diverse. So we know the stats and we know that it works, and yet we still find ourselves in this position. And so in a major piece of research that I did recently, I was arguing that the challenge for us is that diversity, for me, focuses too much on governance. You know, it needs to go beyond just legal protected characteristics of race, gender, disability, age, sexual orientation. If we're going to make a real step change in terms of leadership, you know, as well as in our C-suites. We need to ensure that inclusion and not just diversity is striving a different chord with individuals and people. Because if it's not visible and there are not role models, then people just won't step up. You know, they just will not think that people like us will be able to get into those positions. So that's really, really important. And neurodiversity is playing a big role in helping us to think about that. So in kind of making, and moving to my next slide, in making my challenge before I play this piece of music to you is I'm making a case that if we want to attract the right talent and yield greater employee satisfaction and become better at problem solving and put emotions back into leadership, then we need more entrepreneurialism. We need to take responsible inclusive leadership and make it not just about diversity quotas or numbers on boards, but ensure that staff, regardless of their backgrounds, are included in decision making and strategy and operations. And for me now, there's both an economic and a business imperative for greater leadership inclusivity, as well as the frequently cited social imperative. So before I move on and conclude about trust and culture, I want to just play this piece of music because I think it's a helpful way to sum up some of the debates that we've been having about leadership and what it might look like in the future. And so I use that piece of music not for its lack of diversity, but to talk about leadership. We don't wake up saying we're going to be a responsible leader or an irresponsible leader. We learn our craft, and if we want to be effective leaders in the way that we've all been talking about, in terms of the strengths and the things that challenge and we grapple with. So leadership is an art, and we have to learn our instrument, and we learn our instrument by learning to play the instrument, understanding and being able to read the music. And by music in this context, I mean being able to be able to understand the context and the culture that we operate in. And when we learn the art of our instrument and we learn to play as part of a team, and we learn to conduct, we then think about some of those processes in terms of what leadership might mean. So we don't wake up saying, I'm going to be a conductor. We wake up and we learn our musical instrument. We learn to read the music. We learn to play that instrument, both individually and collectively. And then we have license and experience and depth to conduct. And in some ways, leadership is a facilitative process. And to sum up then, for me, leadership, authenticity, trust, and responsible leadership of the future is going to be based on a number of different dimensions. Trust is going to be absolutely central within the context of that. And we don't spend enough time on actively measuring or managing or developing notions of trust in leadership. We need more process-driven decision-making. And by that, I mean leadership that is inclusive and shared. We're going to need more diverse and inclusive teams, an inclusive working culture that engages staff and stakeholders, not just in the decision-making process, but also in terms of sustainability. And we're going to need intersectional leaders, and shared leadership. Leaders who take a more systematic approach and are better able to anticipate, innovate and collaborate on a whole range of issues. So they become both the conductors, the facilitators and the entrepreneurs. And if we do that, then we create disruption, we create curiosity, and we create communication, and we create challenge. And it's through those challenges some of the most innovative leadership happens. So I'm open to taking, any questions or debates to each other, or, things that's raised for you. I always say in presentations like this, we unravel more questions than we answer. But in some ways, that's the beauty of leadership. I always say, if you found the solution, then you need to kind of move on. So for me, leadership isn't about finding new solutions. It's about working with new processes that are fit for the very changing nature of work in the 21st century. So happy to take, any comments, reflections, questions. Feel free to unmute or put them in chat.
I can see one or two people are typing away.
I'd give this a shot. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. So when all the research is showing that diversity and inclusivity is helping organizations make better decisions and more profitable, so what do you think is, and this research has been out for years now, so I was just wondering, what do you think is holding the Fortune 500 companies to make the change, or try to be more inclusive, since like 97% of the CEOs are men of the Fortune 500 companies?
It's a really simple answer. It's their customers. Their customers of the future are diverse. And so therefore, if they don't change, they lose those customer bases. And so, it's the customers. If you look at who has the spending power, in years to come, in the car industry, women will have more buying power than men. So watch the next time you see adverts on cars and the market they're appealing to. Now that might feel like a very cynical view. That's not for all of them. Some of them have learned incredible lessons, from the past, and are now making a really bold stand about that. But it's driven by their stakeholders, it's driven by their customers, and it's driven, with the need to kind of be sustainable for the future. But also, if you want the best talent, young people are saying, are looking really carefully about the types of institutions they will and won't work for. So if you look at new startup companies and how many are being set up by young people, that speaks volumes. That wouldn't have happened 10 years ago. So there's I guess, what the changing nature of society and the changing nature of work, and if you want the very best skill sets, then you as a company have to be more proactive and change. Whereas before, I think we had this complacency, we're in the top 100, so everybody's going to come and work for us. Well, actually, that isn't the case.
Kiran, can I just jump in on the trust thing? You're probably very familiar with the Edelman annual trust report, which is now saying that people will trust companies more than they trust politicians or the media. I work as a consultant for a company that has, the last couple of years, I see more of this purpose-driven, purpose and values. The problem comes when that's they pay lip service to that and they don't deliver on what they're saying. And I think there is a danger, if you like, of people trusting companies when the companies themselves can't trust themselves to do what they say they want to do.
You're absolutely right, Joycelyn. I'm working with some of the top professional service companies at the moment around the whole diversity and inclusivity agenda, which has been sparked off, at the back of the Black Lives movement. And these are very positive companies that have what I call purposeful action, part of that. And it's almost like we want to do the right things. And I started off by talking about good intentions, bad outcomes. But you can't do those overnight. You've got to be really clear about why you're doing them and how you're doing them and where we go to kind of recruit. So if we continually go, you know, to the same old places with the same old panels, with the same old recruitment processes, then we shouldn't be surprised, as you quite rightly said, you know, we'll end up with the, you know, the same as usual, business as usual. So, you know, trust is becoming a much more prominent feature of what we look for and the kind of questions that we ask of our businesses and our organisations. And as you said, because of the backlash of what's been happening in the context of our political world, you know, so it feels both an exciting time and a challenging time, you know, in equal measures. I believe in those moment in time opportunities. What will we do in these moment of time opportunities? You know, will we grasp that nettle, or, you know, in 12 months' time, when hopefully we have moved, you know, through the pandemic, will we forget this? Because actually the pandemic has shown us how we can work innovatively, how we are resilient, how we are agile, how we are flexible. You know, if we had said less than 12 months ago that, you know, so many of us be working from home in this way, it would have been unheard of because of the lack of trust. Oh no, we can't let people work from home because, you know, how do we know that they're actually doing what they say they're going to be doing? And yet we've shown without any of those kinds of hard measures how hard and effective people have been able to, you know, to work. So you're absolutely right, Jocelyn. You know, trust is going to be an absolutely critical part of the work that we kind of do. I'm really conscious of time, so I don't know how long we've got, Kayla. I hate stifling debate. There's never enough time when we do these things. And if we'd been around a room, I know that the conversation would have been sort of kind of bubbling. But I just want to kind of, you know, make sure that I don't run over. So just wanting to kind of, you know, maybe take some last final reflections or comments if there are any.
Kiran, if I can just comment maybe. Hello?
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. I think one of the things is also to remind people what trust and values are. And I think that's often forgotten. And certainly the evidence in dealing with politicians and accountability and corruption, you know, they always come back on virtually a 5-year cycle. Nobody ever told me that. And it's pretty uniform. So it's also publicizing what is good practice and what is bad practice. I can think back to Nolan on sort of, you know, cash for questions. And at the moment, we're going through that corruption thing of who got that contract, why did they get that contract? And it's a uniform thing. So I think the spiral of reminding people what values are and what are contemporary values is very important.
Yeah, very good points, Phil, and very well made, because you're absolutely right. It's amazing how quickly we forget, you know, and I talk about finding new and novel ways to make sure that we look at both the past in the way that we develop leaders, as well as looking forward, you know, to the future. And we don't gloss over some of those more challenging times that we've had, and be really clear about what it is that we're trying to develop in terms of our culture and our values as part of those processes. Because it's a bit like, you know, trust becomes the new buzzword, doesn't it? You know, who doesn't want a trustful leader? You know, it's a bit like me saying responsible leader or irresponsible leader. Nobody starts their careers thinking I'm going to be an irresponsible leader, and yet irresponsible decisions and irresponsible leadership is part of almost our everyday practices.
Can I come back with something from my history degree at York? This is about trust and leadership and communications. And it was from the course we did, which involved the rise of fascism in Germany. And there was a report of an election rally where Goebbels was addressing a crowd who were very anxious and upset about the cost of food. And various people, the hustings, and various people had made comments about their policy on pricing of food. And then Goebbels said, what I will promise you is he will give you a Nazi price for bread. Everybody burst out cheering. And in a sense, that's a promise you can't not deliver. Whatever you do, it will have met that one. I thought that was a fascinating example of somebody actually summing up the crowd perfectly, making an incredibly well-judged remark, and a remark of extraordinary danger, in that it seems to say everything, but actually promises nothing.
Yeah, I think, Phil, Peter, that we have an opportunity, you know, to learn more about that and bring some of those sorts of examples back into, you know, our learning processes. For me, leadership development is far too rational. You know, we focus so much on the skills development aspects of it without looking at some of that historical context. And similarly to that, I was listening to Radio 4 about, you know, Shakespeare. So I was that kid that grew up in the East End of London. What really inspired me was, you know, doing, I went to see Much Ado About Nothing at Regent's Theatre, Open Park, where kids like me never got exposed to something like that. And the power, you know, they were talking about some of those sort of Macbeth as a modern day story of about power and leadership, you know. And I wonder what we could learn if we were a little bit more creative, you know, using more novel methods to bring, you know, sort of leadership discourse to the forefront, like the kinds of examples that you have used, but also using literature and the arts in the way that we don't often think about in the context of the business world. Thank you.
I am very conscious of the fact that we've had quite a bit more of your time than we had originally anticipated, Kiran, and I'm very grateful for that. I have a feeling that this is a conversation and a topic that we could literally spend the rest of the day and indeed the month on and still not have scratched the surface. But I'm so grateful to you for sharing your time and your insights with us, and for everybody else for joining us and taking part in the conversation. Today's event has been recorded, so we will be sharing that online later. And I've promised in the chat that we'll share the slides with you as well, so that you can read those in your own time later too. But for now, I'd just like to say thank you very much, Kiran, and thank you everyone again, and look forward to seeing you soon.
Yeah, thank you so much, colleagues, for giving up your time and joining us, you know, and it's been just lovely to be able to, you know, hear your voice and your thoughts, because any future research that we do has to be encompassed with the very groups that we kind of work with. So thank you so much for joining us, particularly at a period when I know how busy everybody is.